So on the topic of vaccine passports here, there's a number of glaring issues that we have to address when we're talking about this. And I have David Helfrich here to help break this down because you've just produced a piece, David, that kind of dives through a number of these particular issues. And just full transparency here, I know not everybody has been having access to the same information, the same investigations going on with COVID from a scientific perspective or not. I know mainstream media is often putting out one narrative, independent and alternative media can be putting out a whole bunch of different narratives. And so, understandably so, we're not all on the same page as to what's happening with COVID, and that happens to be an extremely important aspect to this entire discussion because it means that we're all having a different perspective on what COVID is and how dangerous it is and so on and so forth. So why don't we start with some of the most obvious and glaring issues when it comes to vaccine passports and then kind of just go down the list?
Absolutely. How you doing, Joe? Good morning. Good to be with you. So this is obviously a provocative topic, but when you look at the vaccine passport, how it's being rolled out, it does raise a myriad of issues. Principally, it challenges us to think about bodily integrity and bodily autonomy in a way where we stand on a principle. What I mean by that is, if you stand for the right of bodily autonomy, then basically what you're saying is you stand for the right to exclude others from your body, which enables a person to have his or her body whole and intact, free from physical interference. So we certainly understand what this means when it comes to standing for a woman's right to choose what she does with her body, when it comes to reproductive rights, which I stand for as well. But what's interesting is there's a disconnect when it comes to the "my body, my rights" phraseology as it pertains to vaccines. And this is an important thing because if we all can't stand for each other's right to make this important health decision, then we're really not standing for the bodily autonomy of others. This is just one problem with vaccine passports, but I think it's the most fundamental issue we see, that there's just a lack of respect and regard for people to be able to have the autonomy to make this decision for themselves. Because, regardless of what your views are on the vaccine, I happen to be fully vaccinated. Nonetheless, I strongly and adamantly oppose vaccine mandates and vaccine passports because although I made that decision for myself, I would not presume to know or to tell you what to do with your own body. And I certainly respect your right to make your own health decisions. And I want my right as well to be respected to make my own decisions for my body and my health.
Right.
Beyond this, though, there are a myriad of issues when it comes to technical, scientific, and ethical issues, as well as issues of equity, which we can certainly get into.
Yeah, so let's get into some of those, but just for a second, one of the challenges here that I think sort of, supersedes a lot of this stuff when it comes to just the facts is our inability to sort of understand the facts of what's going on as a collective because there's such a large disagreement about what's happening with COVID. And it seems as though like there's not a clear understanding as to what the vaccine's actually designed to do, what it's meant to do. We know that vaccinated individuals can still become infected, right? They know they can still pass it on. They can be, as they call them, asymptomatic carriers, right? This is, something we've been hearing, and therefore they still need to wear masks. And, we're hearing all of this stuff come out from public health. And, it starts to beg the question. It's like, well, why do you need a vaccine passport if even the vaccinated can still get this and still spread it and pass it to other vaccinated individuals and so on and so forth? It's like this from a logic standpoint makes no sense. But there's not a clear understanding around risk management, right? Like that's really what humans are doing, what decisions they're making on a regular basis is I'm trying to manage the risk that I have as a unique individual when it comes to COVID. And when you really look at it, right, the vast majority of people are not at serious risk of dying from COVID-19. Why don't you talk just a little bit just to sort of preface that and give your take on how you decided to get vaccinated when it comes to risk management? Like, what was that for you?
Sure. Well, I do think that this issue raises concerns and draws a highlight to the tension between the duty to be a part of a community and the right to have your individual autonomy, as well, and to balance those two concepts at the same time. My decision essentially came down to the fact that I'm around my mother, I'm around some people who are somewhat immunocompromised. So any chance I have to mitigate my chance to pass it on to somebody else, I decided that that was a good enough reason for me to get the vaccine. So it wasn't necessarily a decision I made for my own self, because I agree with you. Most people are going to fare pretty well with COVID, although it's still somewhat of a lottery. There are a lot of young people who, of course, had very difficult bouts with COVID and long haul symptoms. That said, it's a decision I think a lot of people are making because they feel a duty, right? They feel a duty to their community to try to mitigate the virus. However, because there's still a lot we don't know about this, and this is a fluid situation and it's ever evolving, it's hard to make a sort of a declaration, a definitive declaration on the decision to get vaccinated or not, because data is still coming in. And as we know now, the durability of the immunity with some of these vaccines wane after 6 to 8 months, whereas the natural immunity durability looks pretty broad, and it seems to be a little bit more durable than that. So, the notion that we would just make a definitive decision and say, hey, everyone needs to get vaccinated if they want to travel, sort of flies in the face of the scientific inquiry here, and in terms of allowing this to play out and understanding the different wrinkles and the different developments that are happening almost on a daily basis, to where it's very difficult just to say definitively, you must get vaccinated because this is the only way that we're going to mitigate the pandemic and make sure that it's a safe environment for everyone to live, work, and travel in.
What are some of the other issues with vaccine passports, regardless of just, hey, here's my choice. Once the vaccine passport comes into play, we know these restrictions are probably not going to go away. It's going to be something that sticks around forever. It's kind of a dangerous precedent to set in that regard. But there are other pieces to this as well. What have you found with that?
100%. So first of all, in terms of the vaccines that are available, they're not all the same. Some of them are more efficacious, others are not. A lot of people in high income countries have access to the more efficacious vaccines. And then a lot of people in the global south have access to vaccines like Sinopharm, which are not nearly as efficacious. I mean, we saw what happened in Peru, where Sinopharm was administered and it didn't really have an impact on the pandemic. And in fact, it was somewhat of a negligible effect. So if we're saying that if you want to travel to a certain region, regardless of what vaccine you're vaccinated with, we're going to mandate that, or you're going to have a disparate impact, and those people are not going to have the same kind of efficacy in terms of the vaccine that they chose to get. But also, we have to think about access. So my biggest issue with the vaccine passport comes from the standpoint of equity. We don't have a world where there's an even distribution and even access to the vaccines. A lot of people in the global south do not even have access to any vaccines. So the notion that we're going to say that you're only going to be allowed to travel if you come from a high income country where you have excellent access to the more efficacious vaccines creates a luxury travel class, and essentially creates a caste system, if you will, for people who are allowed to travel and those who are not. So now we're telling people, if you come from Brazil or India and you want to visit a family member in the UK, sorry, you're not allowed to do that, even if it's a family member who's dying because you're not vaccinated. And you don't even have a choice to get vaccinated, right? Beyond the debate we just had, highlighting the issues of choice and bodily autonomy, integrity. Well, what if there's somebody who actually does want to get the vaccine, but they just don't have access to it? So now they're precluded from traveling about the world, accessing opportunity, and just exercising their freedom of mobility in a very fundamental way. These rights are curtailed simply because people don't have access, which of course disproportionately does affect Black and brown people in the global south. So this is an issue, as we were discussing earlier, Joe, where a lot of progressives will be championing vaccine passports, but at the same time, forgetting the fact that there's a disproportionate impact in terms of how these vaccines are administered. Also, a lot of communities have good reason to be suspicious of public health industry. They have good reason to be suspicious of vaccine rollouts because of sort of the lineage and history of public health infrastructure and governments abusing their authority in these situations. So all of this has to be factored in. And to me, the point that we're just going to kind of brush it all aside and say, oh, well, we don't really care about the context and nuance of that. We're just going to kind of have a blanket universal mandate to get vaccinated if you want to travel and enjoy your life and access opportunity, to me is unbelievably inequitable. And I'm just really shocked at how many people sort of are agreeing with this without considering all these factors.
For sure. And I, the lack of nuance, the lack of exploratory curiosity and empathy really is often a sign of a sort of a mass psychosis, a mass trauma that's taking place on the planet. We see that when we get into that fear and that panic state. Our ability to really connect with one another, understand each other, explore things really just starts to disappear. For anybody wanting to check that out more, we just released a piece on that here on the channel. But this is part of it, right? We're seeing a masses that cannot come to agree on how dangerous COVID really even is. We see this, and call me a conspiracy theorist here if you like, but we see this strong push for very totalitarian mandates to come into play, regardless of the fact that there isn't a very clear and large danger that we can all agree on. And that to me plays for some sort of larger agenda, some sort of larger thing that might be playing through government and big tech and these massive corporations. Have you any feelings on that kind of thing, like where this might be leading, maybe in the context of a great reset or something like that, the ever-increasing surveillance state?
For sure. So we already know the history of governments seizing the opportunity to use a crisis to institute some draconian measures to sort of curtail civil liberties. Obviously, this happened in the aftermath of 9/11. We saw the Patriot Act rolled out just months after 9/11, I believe it was 2 months after 9/11. And that was really an intense curtailing of our civil liberties to the point where the government basically broadened its powers to spy on its own citizens. And of course, we didn't know this was happening until the 2013 disclosures from Edward Snowden. But in 2021, we're still dealing with what were supposed to be temporary measures in the aftermath of 9/11, established in the Patriot Act that enabled the government to engage in mass surveillance of its people. And it turns out that actually the Patriot Act and the powers that the government was vested in there has not really stopped any significant terrorist attacks. And it hasn't done anything but enable the government to spy on its citizens and create a surveillance state that we're still dealing with, and we're still dealing with the repercussions of. So in the vein of COVID, we see where a crisis like this would be used to further curtail civil liberties, enhance the surveillance state, and build an architecture of surveillance around the world that we may not ever be able to retract from. Right. So when you already see how big tech companies are scrambling to take advantage of this, I mean, we see a lot of situations where there's thermal cameras trying to detect whether people have fevers. They're trying to use blockchain technology to ascertain whether or not people are vaccinated or not. And we have to ask the question, where is this private information, this health information that should be sensitive data that we own and that we have a personal autonomous right to? This is going to get in the hands of commercial interests where our data is going to be sold to the highest bidder. It could even presumably come to the hands of law enforcement to already affect communities that are already over-policed. So all this information and data that we would just give out, it's highly unlikely that it would just be used in the narrow scope to understand whether or not somebody's vaccinated or not. This sort of creates an environment where we just sort of acquiesce to mass surveillance system and forget about the right of private property and privacy and data integrity of our own data and our own health information to the point where if we relinquish this, it's very difficult for us to get it back. And this is shown time and time throughout history. Whenever these kind of civil liberties and the hard-fought gains for personal rights and liberties are taken away, the fight it takes to get them back and reclaim them is immense and often insurmountable.
Yeah, it's almost like now's the time to really pay attention and ask, like, what has history shown us? What have these past events shown us? Are we really so desperate to get back to normal that we're willing to live in potentially a very undesirable world as a result? And of course, we don't all have access at the moment to, we have the opportunity to access the same information, but we're not all accessing the same information when it comes to what's going on with COVID. And so we may be, just sort of saying, well, this discussion that we're having here is complete bullcrap because this is the most dangerous disease that we've seen in forever, right? If you're looking at one side of the spectrum. So, for people that might be watching this and thinking that, maybe challenge yourself to check out some other perspectives on what's happening with COVID. A lot of the censorship has changed that, but that might give a little bit of a different insight into what we're talking about here. But David, thanks so much for coming on. And of course, there's a piece that you wrote that dives into this a little bit more deeply as well on the Pulse for anybody who wants to check that out. But appreciate your investigation and wisdom on this one.
I appreciate you, Joe. Good to be with you all.